Be reading from 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 12. For now we see only a reflection, as in a mirror. But then, meaning when we're with God, we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known.
Howdy. Good morning. Well, you could probably guess from the scripture reading that that is not a Father's Day text. I still want to wish you happy Father's Day, but you're not getting a Father's Day sermon. And you dads might be like, you might be mixed feelings on that. Some of you are saying that's not fair. We got a Mother's Day sermon. And then some of you are thinking, I didn't really want you to talk about what I have to do. Let my wife in on that secret. But we're still going to talk about Father's Day. We're going to talk about fathers at least next week. This week, I was trying to prepare my mind for some of the lessons that are going on at camp. And one of the topics that I was given I thought would be pretty good to share with everyone. Second good news about that is maybe this one will be a little shorter. Maybe we can get to Father's Day lunch pretty quickly. Yeah, there we go. I said maybe. I'm not sure. I don't know until it comes out. That's how we ended up with a couple. I apologize for like some 40-minute sermons. Don't. Okay, we'll just move on. We sing sometimes an old song. Let's see if you remember it. Do you know this song? We'll understand it all by and by. Tempted and tried, we're oft made to wonder why it should be thus all the day long. And that's how the song starts. And I guess one of the interesting things about that idea, about thinking about and dealing with the truth and existence of temptations and trials in our life, is what the Bible says toward them. So first, let's go to Job. Job chapter 1. This is not going to be an exhaustive study on Job, but we're going to hit the high points. Job chapter 1. In the first part of Job chapter 1, it's almost like the curtains are peeled back from a heavenly scene of God and the sons of God, that being the angels, and then even Satan. Okay, verse 6. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. So you have this discussion, I know it sounds strange, between God and Satan. And in that conversation, could you imagine this happening to you? God and Satan are talking and your name gets dropped? Have you thought about my servant? Put your name there. Wouldn't that be the strangest thing to imagine? But that's exactly what God does. Have you considered, have you thought about my servant Job? Verse 8. And then Satan, being the accuser, starts accusing. He starts attacking Job. He says, do you know why Job is faithful? Because you've put a hedge around him and about his house and all that he has on every side. Put forth your hand now, touch all that he has, he will surely curse you to your face. Now the next part of this discussion I want you to understand is very, very important for how we understand God and temptations and trials. You have to get this to understand this. Because what's said by Satan is Satan tells God, touch your hand to him, curse him. And if you're not careful, you might just say that's exactly what happened. God touched his hand to him and cursed him. It's very important that right here there's a contrast. There's a shift. God will not do that. God will not do that to Job. But what he will do, and this is going to be the thought we're struggling with, he will allow Satan to tempt him. He will allow Satan to try him. But just so we're understanding the flow, do you get the distinction? God will not do it. The most he will do is allow. And so that's exactly what Satan does. And that's in verse 12, that thought. Behold, all that he has is in your power. Okay? That's Satan has to, if there's going to be tempting and trying, it has to come from Satan. Verse 13. Now on the day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and donkeys feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans attacked and took them. They also slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. So the first message is, Job, you've lost your oxen, your donkey, and all your servants that were working them, except I alone have escaped. While Job was in the middle of getting the opposite of the gospel, the opposite of good news, he was getting very, very bad news. It says, while this servant, verse 16, was still speaking, another also came and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another also came and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 bands and made a raid on the camels and took them and slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another also came and said, so he's lost everything. Your sons and your daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came from across the wilderness, struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they died. And I alone have escaped to tell you. Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head, and he fell on the ground and cursed God. Is that what it says? It wouldn't be crazy if it said that, right? But what it says is he fell on the ground and worshiped. What did Job lose? Every possession and the people he loved. And he worshiped God in that moment. Now this is earlier on in Job. Job says, if it's God, I understand. God gave me everything. The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. I will still worship him. Satan comes the second time. Look at chapter 2 and verse 5. Satan answered the Lord and said, skin for sin. Yes, all that a man has he will give for his life. Verse 5. However, put forth your hand now and touch his bone and all his flesh. He will curse you to your face. Same discussion as in chapter 1. The Lord doesn't do it, but he says to Satan, behold, he is in your power. Only spare his life. Now, the majority of Job after this is a discussion between Job and his 3 friends. And we're not going to read it exhaustively. But what you need to understand is what his friend said over and over and over is, Job, the Lord must be doing this to you. And if the Lord is doing this to you, you must have done something wrong. Job, you need to repent. All sounds good. All sounds, maybe so, especially the way they thought. But then you get to the end, chapter 41, in verse 7, and God says, your 3 friends didn't make any sense. They didn't speak the truth. Only my servant Job has spoken rightly of me. And Job's idea is God allowed it, but God didn't cause it. Okay? Now here's why this is interesting. At least here's one more layer to why this whole story is interesting. Job is most likely the oldest book in our scriptures. So think about that and think about what that means. Job being the oldest book in our scriptures. Now this is a little technical. You might say, how on earth would you know that Job is the oldest book in the scriptures? There's two kind of ideas there if you have to know. One is that the text itself, when you look at the Hebrew, Job uses older Hebrew words than the rest of the Bible. So all languages work that way. For example, you could look at Old English. If you find something that's printed a long, long time ago, instead of use, trivia, anybody know what they used? V's. It's just fun trivia. That's why they call a W a W, even though it's two V's. They didn't change. Okay, wasn't as interesting to you. We'll move on. Also, another example, the Y was often placed in words that we spell with an I. Okay? The Hebrew version of this is what happened with Job. It uses older spellings, different letters, that type of thing. Now, there's also a contextual argument for this. When you read Job, there's no reference to Moses, there's no reference to the temple, there's no reference to the tabernacle. This story takes place in a those things time. To even show that further, when you look at the early part of Job, I don't think I wrote it down. Job himself offers burnt offerings. That's verse 5 of chapter 1. Job doesn't take an offering to the priest. He was the priest of the family. Now you might say that is just an interesting factoid, interesting trivia. Why does it matter that the book of Job is the oldest thing in Scripture? Here's why I think it matters. God has been revealing His will to us for thousands of years. And the very first written thing we have is Job. The very first thing that God wrestled with people through and that people still struggle with today. Like, isn't that the number one reason people say they can't just get behind the fact that there's a God? Because there's evil in the world? Because bad things happen? That is the same theological problem they had back then. That's the same thing Job seeks to start answering. Okay. Now, the second one, Genesis. Genesis itself is not quite as old as Job when it was written, but it covers the beginning of creation. And it covers the fall of man. And what you'll notice if you compare Job to Genesis 3, when Adam and Eve are tempted, did God tempt Adam and Eve? Did God do it? Who did it? But did God allow it? God allowed it. We're going to have to think through that. He didn't do it, but He allowed it. Both are getting at the same thing. Genesis, how does it start? With an explanation of why the ground is cursed, why life is burdensome, why it's hard, why suffering, why pain, why all of this happens. Both Job and Genesis 1 through 3 explain that evil is in the world because of Satan, not because of God. In the New Testament, just like these two earlier references, James offers a similar apologetic to that. He does not explain suffering and temptation by blaming God. Here's what he says, James 1, 3 through 14. I know I'm doing a lot of reading. In a second, I hired out some other readers, and Josh is going to come read a verse for us. James 1, 13 and 14. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, and He Himself does not tempt anyone, but each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust. So he says that kind of generically. God can't tempt. God doesn't tempt. That's not in His nature. And there's a few other New Testament things that help us get behind this idea of trials and temptations. One is in 2 Corinthians 12, 8 through 10. A lot of reading this morning, but bear with me. It's all connected. 2 Corinthians 12, 8 through 10. Paul talks about what he called his thorn in the flesh. It's never explicitly stated what that is, just a thorn in the flesh. And he says, concerning this, I implored the Lord 3 times that it might leave me. And he has said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. God allows Paul to be tried. Do you see, though, how Paul gave us the first answer of why? Why would God allow this thing that causes Paul to suffer to remain? Why would he let it stay? What has it done for Paul? Paul's weak. If you're weak, are you weak? If you're weak, who do you have to depend on? Who do you have to? Not yourself, but God. And the sooner we come to grips with our weakness through temptations and trials, especially trials, we will have to depend on him. Or go back to James. Had to sing the song in my head to find it. James. James 1 and verse 12. Blessed is a man who perseveres under trial, for once he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those who love him. Now, you have to really understand verse 12 for exactly what verse 12 says. Do trials approve you? James says so, but don't read into that God is the one causing them. God allows them. He allows trials. He allows temptations. There's another hard one in James. James 1, 2 through 4. Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its perfect pursuit, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. The 3 things that temptations and trials do. They provide endurance. They cause us to find our strength in God, and they show an approved faith. That is to say, they show that faith is genuine. You can say you have faith, but until you've actually had to struggle through something, you don't really know. All right, Josh, come up for us. Josh is going to read Daniel 3, 19 through 25. Daniel 3, 19 through 25. I picked Josh because he's my favorite.
Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude towards them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual, and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent, and the furnace was so hot, that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. And King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that were tied up and thrown into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, your majesty." He said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like the son of the gods."
So I'm sure you're probably familiar with what's going on there. Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, they're demanded to worship King Nebuchadnezzar, to fall to the statue. And they won't. That's another way of saying they're being tried, okay? But here's the point that we're getting at for these next items that we're going to look at. Was God there? Where was God in that story? Where at? Didn't you hear Nebuchadnezzar when he was amazed? Weren't there 3 men? Who did he see? A 4th that looked to him like the Son of God. Where is God when they were being persecuted? Right in the fire with them. Now, here's the challenging part that I want to make sure we understand. We know God was there because there was a 4th guy in the fire and they weren't burned up. Would God have been there even if they didn't see him? God's always there. Okay, we're going to have Jack come read Exodus 13, 20 through 22. I picked Jack because this is an Exodus text, and he's got reddish hair, and there's a burning bush in Exodus. His last name's Bush. That's a real clever joke.
After leaving Succoth, they camped at Etham on the edge of the desert. By day, the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people.
In this Exodus text, well, let's just say this. How long is Israel going to be in the wilderness? How long? 40 years. Would they be by themselves? Where is God in that text? By day, he was a pillar of smoke, and at night, fire. And they could see it. And he was there. But then let's ask the question. Even if they couldn't see it, would he be there? Matt's going to read another text for us, the last one. I picked Matt because this text is Matthew. Matthew 14. That's his name. Also, he could read a James text. That's his other name. That's his other name.
Do you want me to read it?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from the land, buffeted by the waves, because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid."
So, in this text, the disciples are being battered by the wind and the waves. Invisibly, they're alone, but you kind of see where this is going. Were they alone? Were they really alone? God was there. And this time, Jesus showed up. He showed up with a miracle, walking on water. And as we read all of these narratives, you can really almost pick any of the story. Like, I'll give you examples. When you're in Egypt, God is with you. When you're in Babylon, God is with you. When you're suffering, God is with you. When you're being tempted by Satan, God is with you. When you're in a fiery furnace, God is with you. When you're in a lion's den, God is with you. When you're in the wilderness, God is with you. When you walk through the valley of the shadow of death, God is with you. When your ship is being battered by storms, God is with you over and over and over. And then you have to ask, do these mean anything? Or are they just stories in a book? Do they mean anything for your life? And here's what I think they teach us. When you're alone, God is with you. When you're afraid, God is with you. When you're dealing with depression, God is with you. When you have lost someone you love, God is with you. When your spouse leaves you, God is with you. When you're a new parent and when your nest empties, God is with you. When you're a foreigner away from home, God is with you. When you are orphaned or widowed, God is with you. This is easier to say when an angel appears in the fire with you. It's easier to say when a cloud of fire or a cloud of smoke or fire goes out in front of you. When you carry a box of testimonies of his faithfulness. When you can see the bronze serpent that healed your ancestors. When Jesus himself walks out of the storm towards your boat in the middle of the ocean through battering waves and through incessant wind, then it's easy to say. But what about when you don't have the physical manifestations of his presence? What about when you don't have that physical manifestation of his faithfulness? Do you still believe? Or let's say it more biblically, do you still trust God in those moments? Because that's what makes Job so special. You can tell pretty early on in the book, Job doesn't understand why he's being tried. He doesn't understand why he's being tempted. But he does trust God through the process. He does have faith. And so, do I always understand it when something bad happens to me or when something bad happens to you? No. And you don't have to. It would be an understatement to say no. But do I believe that God is there with us? Absolutely. He is there when we face death because He put on flesh and died Himself. Everything we go through, He's with us. I don't have to understand it, but I trust you. That's one of the things that I say to Katie when she's trying to explain something we need to do. I don't understand what you're saying, honey, but let's do it. I trust you. This is Jerry shaking his head. That's why he's an elder. There's wisdom there. And that's how it works with God. To see things from God's seat is an impossible burden. You don't have to understand everything. That's something you will never be able to do. But to trust the God that sits there, that's all we're called to do. To trust Him. To have faith. Back to the song, right? Tempted and tried, we're oft made to wonder. What's implied? We don't understand it, but maybe we will by and by. Maybe one day you can ask Him. Maybe as you get through it, you'll understand why you went through something. But one day we will know what we can't know now. That's why I had Robin read 1 Corinthians 13:12. I'm going to repeat that. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I will know fully, just as I also have been fully known. But now faith, hope, love abide, these three. The greatest of these is love. Now just really think about what's being said. Did the Corinthian church have full understanding of God's will and plan and everything right there? No. Paul says it pretty clearly. It's like we're looking in a dim mirror. It's fuzzy. You can see the silhouette. You can see the outline, but you can't see it perfectly. But does that mean God has left you? You're on your own? He's left you on your own? That's what I was trying to say. It's not, because He's given us something. Not full knowledge, not understanding, but something to get us through. And what is it? Faith, hope, and love. One day faith will be realized, because faith is the expectation, the thing that you trust even though you can't see it. We believe it's going to happen one day, the things that we have faith for. The same with hope. Love, on the other hand, is said to be the greatest by Paul because I think it's already here in its fullness. Faith will be realized, hope will be realized. When we're with God, what do you have to have hope for? You're already going to have an intimate knowledge. It's already going to happen. But do you know what will still be there? Even then, love. Love now, love then. So trust Him. What do we have to get us through the night until we see everything fully? The love of God that was expressed in His Son, and you can have those blessings now. In a moment, I'm going to extend the invitation. Right before that, I have an admission. On the way up here, I left Stacy Brammer's Bible in the office, and we're going to give that to her after the invitation. If you want to partake in these blessings, if you want to show your trust for the God that is there, if you want to be immersed into Christ, or you need the prayers of the church, would you come as we stand and as we sing?